Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zubko. On the 14th of May, CNBC published an article from which I quote, "Starting this year, President Joe Biden will quadruple tariffs on imported Chinese electric vehicles from 25% to 100%. The import tax on Chinese solar cells will double from 25% to 50%. And tariffs on some Chinese steel and aluminum imports will increase more than threefold, from 7.5% up to 25%. Biden said China heavily subsidized all these products, pushing Chinese companies to produce far more than the rest of the world can absorb and then dumping the excess products on the markets at unfairly low prices. When you make tactics like these, it's not competing, it's cheating." Beijing respond, "The US escalation of Section 301 tariffs contradicts President Biden's commitments not to suppress or contain China's development and not to seek decoupling from China. The US should immediately correct its wrongdoings and revoke the tariffs measures against China. China will take resolute measures to defend its own interest." Let's discuss Chinese export and energy security. My expert today is Quill Robinson. Hello, Quill.
Hi, Martin. Good to be here.
Quill Robinson is a senior program manager and associate fellow with the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He is also a senior advisor with Conserve America and a Clean Energy Leadership Institute fellow. So, Quill, quite dynamic and quite a strong introduction. Many numbers, many ideas, and many implications. So, let's start with the first question that I have, and that's how do Chinese energy exports influence the energy security policies of the United States and the European Union? I'm interested in your thoughts, in your general overview, because many people, they quite struggle to connect the exports, imports, tariffs, and energy security into one environment or one comprehensive thought.
Absolutely. Well, those are a lot of complex topics right there. And I think it's even for us who spend our days, spend our jobs thinking about these issues, it's a lot to handle. I think for many of us in the United States or in Europe, generally in the Western world, our interactions with our energy systems are relatively limited, right? We expect the lights to turn on when we flip the switch. In the rare instance that does not happen, it's quite shocking. And then increasingly over the last couple of decades, I think many people in the US and Europe have thought about energy in the context of climate change, and have gotten involved with efforts or are aware of efforts to shift, to transition our energy systems so that they are less carbon intensive and so that we are more in line with a future that would be compatible with net zero. So I think those are the points of interaction that many people have with their energy systems. And obviously from that headline, there's a lot more to it. The other thing that I would point out is as this energy transition, which we hear more and more about, is progressing much slower than many people would expect. We still rely on fossil fuels around the world for around 80% of our energy. As this progresses, there are some major geopolitical changes happening, even with that limited amount of progression that has happened thus far. So as we know, there is a certain geopolitical landscape that exists in the fossil fuel world, or has existed in the fossil fuel world, right? The Middle East is an important geographic region because that's where a lot of fossil resources are. A place like Venezuela, there's an interesting story where they have massive reserves, but haven't been able to develop it because of the lack of the proper political economy. Russia is also an important player, and we saw in 2022 and still are seeing the ramifications of Vladimir Putin's weaponization of the fossil resources that Europe had previously relied upon. So there's a particular geography to the fossil fuel world. Now, as we are transitioning slowly but surely towards clean energy resources, the energy geography is changing. So all of a sudden, China is a very important player when it comes to our energy systems, because they are the ones who, in fact, manufacture 80% of the world's solar panels, process 90% of the critical minerals which are required to build clean energy technologies. They make around 70% of wind turbines. And so these technologies that are necessary to transition our energy system to be compatible with a better climate future suddenly are very concentrated in this country that is a strategic adversary of the United States and also of other nations in the West. And so that's why I think that we're seeing a rapid transition, not just in terms of our energy systems, but also how energy plays a role in geopolitics. And I think it's a fascinating topic, and it's something that we certainly all need to pay a whole lot more attention to, because I'll just kind of leave you with this statistic that I think really illustrates the significance of the concentration of manufacturing in China. You know, OPEC controls around 40% of global oil exports. And then you think about the numbers I listed earlier, 80%, 90%, 75% of these clean energy technologies. And I think it really puts a fine point on the geopolitical importance of this concentration of clean energy technology manufacturing in China.
When I meet with experts, we speak about the focus of the US energy strategists. And sometimes it seems that they are focusing too much on Russia and not that much on China. In some way, we can link the US energy security more with China than with Russia. What's your opinion about that?
For the US, absolutely, right? Because the US does not and has not historically imported significant amounts of fossil fuels for Russia. Whereas with Europe, it's a little bit of a different story. Now, when it comes to the numbers that I listed previously, when it comes to wind turbines and solar panels and critical minerals processing, of course, that is the global share of manufacturing that China controls. But it's a little bit more nuanced if you look in the US context. So, for instance, when it comes to solar panels, we have actually, over the last around dozen years, brought the share of Chinese solar panels imported directly into the United States down to around 1 or 2%. Now, there is a caveat here, and this has also been in the news and kind of touches upon the headline that you brought up. In response to this move, and this was actually something that was there was continuity between U.S. presidential administrations, between starting with Obama, then with Trump, and now with Biden, a steady ramping up of tariffs and other protectionist measures to bring down that percentage of solar panels being imported into the U.S. from China. The caveat here is that a lot of these Chinese firms realized that they could actually go set up factories and do the final step in the manufacturing process in a Southeast Asian country, and then export it to the U.S. and make their way around those tariffs and still have access. In fact, today, I think around 70% of U.S. solar imports are actually from Southeast Asia, but in practice, they are Chinese solar panels. And that is actually, there is actually, you know, kind of adding to the complexity of this situation. 2 years ago, President Biden issued a pause on tariffs against Southeast Asian solar panels. That is now coming back into effect. And so that has new implications around where we're going to import our solar panels from. So again, that really illustrates this kind of new and rapidly changing map of energy that is happening as we transition our energy system.
But this is quite interesting, because also when you speak with those people graduated from Harvard and other business school like Wharton, and they are Chinese, they never tell you that they want to establish a Chinese company. They always say, "Oh, my company will be international," you know, to bypass all those measures, you know. So that's also an interesting move. That, as you said, you know, those panels or parts are coming from Southeast Asia. So those tariffs that Biden is trying to impose, or has imposed, basically, do they count with this international, or are they directly only against the Chinese companies?
Well, they're against the Chinese solar cells. So that's a particular component in the value chain of solar panels. It is an area where it is a step in the value chain that is particularly concentrated in China. But I think, again, the point of this here, the effort, what the Biden administration is trying to do is they've made all of these investments via the Inflation Reduction Act into domestic solar manufacturing, namely with the 45X and 48C tax credits. So they've invested billions and billions of dollars. We're going to be spending likely over $1 trillion on the Inflation Reduction Act over the next decade. A big chunk of that goes towards spurring domestic clean energy manufacturing. A big chunk of that goes towards solar. I think what they're trying to do here is to make sure that those investments don't go to waste and that those domestic manufacturers do not get undercut by their Chinese counterparts. Because as we know, the Chinese have built massive economies of scale over the last 15, 20 years when it comes to solar. Very integrated supply chains, and they've also really driven down the price like crazy. We saw, I think, this year or last year, the cost of Chinese solar panels fell by about 60%. And by the beginning of this year, the cost of a Chinese solar panel was around 44% cheaper than a US solar panel. And so I think what this tariff is really an effort to protect the investments that the Biden administration has made thus far and give these domestic manufacturers a fighting chance.
So that means that there is a direct link between Chinese export and competitiveness of the US companies. But when we say competitiveness of the US companies, are they competitive with, for instance, peers from different countries, not only the China?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So initially, the Biden administration made the case, part of their argument for the Inflation Reduction Act is that not only were we going to bring down US emissions by deploying clean energy technologies at home, but we were going to bring down the cost of these clean energy technologies for the entire world. Now, interestingly, I think it's actually China that has brought down the cost of clean energy technologies around the world. And it now seems that through the Inflation Reduction Act and these newly announced tariffs and probably other protectionist trade measures that we have and will continue to see, it's not just about driving down the cost of the technologies, it's also about protecting nascent industries. And I think this is actually an interesting point of kind of commonality between President Trump and President Biden's worldview is that it's not just about having the cheapest, most affordable products for any place around the world. We're no longer in this kind of free trade, free markets mindset, but President Biden is really trying to protect this nascent industry at home. Now, when it comes to other countries, obviously China makes, just a number that I'll throw out there for you, which is really blows my mind, is that they actually last year had twice the solar panel manufacturing capacity as the total number of solar panels that were installed last year. So it is an absolutely globally. So it's an absolutely massive scale. So they are undeniably the dominant force in solar manufacturing around the world right now. Southeast Asia is another place where there is manufacturing happening, but it's also very integrated with the Chinese supply chains. Another area that I do think is quite interesting is India. India has a massive solar market domestically. They're deploying a lot of solar technology. I think they're number 3, maybe after China and the US. They have quite cheap labor. They have a strong desire to build up their manufacturing sector. And they are also not so friendly with the Chinese as well. So that India is actually a place that I'm watching quite closely because I think that, while US solar panels are not going to be competitive internationally unless we see some sort of transformative technology that cuts the cost of them in half. But if the US is looking to diversify away from Chinese solar on the international market and give countries like Brazil or Kenya or other emerging markets an alternative to Chinese solar panels, India is an interesting place to look. And in fact, the U.S. government has been making some investments there to support the growth of the Indian solar industry as well.
Mm-hmm. And also, Quill, when we speak about how competitive are the American companies, as American, do you see any domestic campaigns, for instance, install solar panels made in the United States? Or something like that to support the domestic companies, because this is, I think, quite important that people know what they are installing.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, when I remember when I was a kid, like the Made in China sticker just meant that something was cheap, right? But if a Made in China sticker on a solar panel today means that there is a good chance that it's connected with Uyghur slave labor, it means that there were probably a higher it was probably the factory that it was constructed in probably burns coal for its energy. It also means that in the context of 2024, it came from a strategic adversary of my home country, the United States. So we're living in a much different world than we were 15, 20 years ago. And it's not just a matter of cost, particularly as we're thinking about something like climate change, which is about the future of humanity. I think people also want to think about human rights, other environmental impacts, and what sort of values that they are supporting with the purchase of this sort of clean energy technology. Now, yes, I do think that you can go out and buy American-made solar panels, but there's also sort of the question of like, what is an American-made solar panel? Like, what percentage of it has to be constructed here? That's certainly a quite pertinent question right now. Also, within the IRA itself, as you may know, there are also provisions when it comes to batteries and critical minerals, and to be eligible for products to be eligible for IRA tax credits. There are certain restrictions about how much percentage could be sourced from China, where they're sourced from, and so on and so forth. We're seeing this play out in the EV conversation right now. There are many EVs on the market in the US right now, but there's only a small share of them that are actually eligible for the full $7,500 tax credit because of some of these restrictions that have been intentionally set. But I could certainly see this being a larger and larger part of the conversation, because it's really not as simple as like solar panels good, fossil fuels bad. There's a lot more considerations that go into this.
Yeah, definitely. What about environmental concern? When the United States is importing, the solar panels and components for producing solar panels and the whole thing, are there any environmental concerns? Are there any requirements, or it's mostly done based on price? Cheaper, better?
Right. Well, there are the tariffs on the Chinese solar panels right now, certainly. There is also the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is in play, which actually doesn't just apply to solar, but a whole swath of different products. But it actually puts the onus on the importer to prove that their product is not sourced from a factory connected to Uyghur slave labor in Xinjiang. So there are a lot of considerations there. I mean, one thing I would point out on the environmental impact, and I think this is something that is sometimes undercovered and goes back to this issue of there's more than just climate change. For example, in Xinjiang, 70% of the power comes from coal there. So presumably a lot of, that's going to have a higher emissions profile than a solar panel made in that region of China is going to have a much higher emissions profile. But there's more than that too, right? Like actually how we're installing utility scale solar here in the United States matters as well, right? That could have deleterious effects on the ecosystem if you're covering acres and acres of sensitive land with panels, which can be done in a responsible way, but still will have some impact. So as we're having this conversation, I think, back to economist Thomas Sowell's point, there's no such thing as a solution, just trade-offs, right? And I think that's probably a more healthy way to think about the different tools that we have in our tool belt to reach the goals that we would like to reach with our energy system. It's not quite as simple as like switch from bad fossil to good renewables.
Yeah, Elon Musk also said that you need a 100 mile by 100 mile or something like that to power the whole United States.
Could have been, yeah, yeah.
So
If only though, but then you have to figure out how to, whose land you're going to take to put that on, and how you're going to where do you put the transmission to get it to where it needs to be, and so on and so forth.
And who is going to control this one unit?
Right.
That's
Exactly.
a very strategic decision.
It is.
I have another question about the solar, and let's turn the perspective a little bit. Can you see any positive effects of this clash, Chinese US solar panel import export? Because in some way, you must have that sort of critical review and overview of the situation, and maybe even Chinese help to the United States to maybe progress the development of the solar technology, maybe manufacturing procedures or something like that.
Sure, that's a really interesting question. I think I would zoom out and kind of look at the history of solar to maybe understand where it's going. So in 1954 in New Jersey, in Bell Labs, the first solar cell was invented. Several years later, it was used on a NASA satellite. And so we used solar cells on NASA satellites to generate energy, of course, it's all in the United States. in the 70s, the Japanese in the 70s and the 80s, the Japanese were played a very important role in pushing this technology forward. In the early 2000s, the Germans established their feed-in tariff and really accelerated the deployment of solar in Germany. And then also in the early 2000s, the Chinese said this is going to be one of our strategic industries, solar cells, and they invested a ton of money into building out these supply chains that we were talking about, attracting Chinese nationals who'd been working for solar firms abroad to come back. And they built over the course of 10, 15 years a massive, massive solar industry. In 2005, they were less than 10% of global solar manufacturing. By 2012, they were 40%. In the last couple of years, they're now up to 80%. In the same time, since 1975, the cost per watt of a solar cell has gone from around $100 to around 10 cents. So it was a very international effort, making solar what it is today, absolutely dirt cheap. The Chinese have played a massive role in that in the last couple of years and pushed a lot of innovation forward. And because of that, we have an incredibly cheap technology that can generate energy at the utility scale or on a rooftop in a rural village in Africa. And it's a really important tool. The Chinese have played a significant role in that. And I think that we probably are a lot better off for having cheap and abundant solar technologies. So no, this is not just a story of like, the Chinese are bad and America is good. I think it's just a question of understanding the trade-offs going forward, hopefully making this technology even more available and applicable and meeting our needs from increasing energy access to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. But I think the thing that's on my mind right now is let's make sure that we are not exclusively focusing on the climate benefits of this technology at the expense of our own supply chains, our values around human rights, our economic security, and so on and so forth. And going forward, actually, I do think that there is, now that the US has really woken up and realized like, hey, we're not okay with our strategic adversary having potentially 90 or 95% market share of this very important technology. We're starting to see the effects of that. And in fact, just I believe it was last week, there was an announcement that I think it's Q Cells has been working with this Israeli startup that has figured out how to slash the amount of silver required for the next generation TopCon panels. So that's a lot of jargony talk right there, but essentially a South Korean owned company that is now setting up shop in the United States and building vertically integrated solar manufacturing in the United States, worked with an Israeli company, and they figured out a way to bring down the silver content, of course, a very important, expensive material. And that's presumably going to make, the next generation of solar panels a lot cheaper. So I do think that this competition, and now that the US has woken up to the Chinese, kind of how good the Chinese are, I think it'll continue to bring down the price and push the technology forward and hopefully create a little bit more of an equilibrium in terms of the distribution of these supply chains. So they don't have, a single country does not have this sort of geopolitical leverage and economic leverage.
And do you have any data about recycling possible old solar panels, or what's the time I can use as a single person having a house outside of the town? I have solar panels, and I don't know, like 20 years, maybe 10 years, or how does it work? Do you have any data that we can project the solar panel installation and also the innovation?
Yeah, so to my knowledge, most solar panels last around 20 to 30 years. And so that is a good amount of time. And that's also important to keep in mind where I didn't bring this up earlier, but there is a fundamental difference between fuels like oil or gas and units. Right? If you buy your solar panel, you install it, you stick it in the ground, presumably it works for, or on your roof and works for 20 to 30 years. That's a little different from having to continuously pump gas into your car or import oil from another country. So that's just a bit of an aside. But yeah, so they usually last around 20 to 30 years. To my knowledge, there are ways to recycle solar panels, but obviously as they expire, as they get old after a couple of decades, there's going to be a need to do that. Hopefully, there's going to be sort of a circular economy element there and a market to do so. I think sometimes there's a bit of panic around wind turbines and solar panels and what you do with them at end of life. Uh, Valid, an important issue that we can probably figure out how to take care of. But yeah, so we're looking at about that time span.
Let's turn a page a little bit and let's speak about the batteries. Because when we have solar technology, automatically you think about storage for electricity, and you think about batteries. Like what sort of batteries do you need, and how many, and how expensive, and where to install them. So in the battery business, what's the position of the Chinese export to the United States and Chinese domestic production?
Sure. Well, to my knowledge, the Chinese they control around 90% of critical mineral processing. A lot of these like lithium and nickel and cobalt, these critical minerals are required for these sorts of batteries. And they make a majority of the batteries in the world for EVs as well. I think so the EV batteries are one thing, but then there's also the long duration storage batteries, which are being developed so that we could store the energy generated by solar, for example. So that's a little bit different. Sometimes there's different technologies, but the Chinese also have a dominant position in this field as well.
Mm-hmm. And what's the progress of installing energy storage facilities in the United States? Do you have any data about this?
Sure. Well, this is not my particular area of focus. I will say from folks who do track the battery space pretty closely, from what I've heard, this is actually one of the areas that we are doing even better. The US is actually catching up, and we're seeing a good amount of progress there in terms of seeding a domestic battery manufacturing industry, sourcing the materials, and so on and so forth. But again, this is really critical, right? As we know, the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. You have this intermittency issue with renewables, and if we want to have them provide energy for anything more than just a marginal amount, marginal share for the grid, we're going to need long duration storage at a very, very significant scale. And so this is a critical area to focus on. And if we are not focusing on it, then I think that a lot of the emphasis that has been placed on renewables is truly misguided. But from what I've heard, there's good progress happening. But I think sort of the choke point being the critical mineral sourcing, and then also being able to do the R&D to develop these sorts of technologies to do that domestically.
Great. So when we take solar panels and we take batteries into one basket, can we describe the position of China in energy transition of the United States, bearing in mind, the export and bearing in mind the tariffs?
Well, I would describe it as dominant. They're in a dominant position, with the important caveat that some of the dynamics with fuels versus units are somewhat different. But it's their dominant position. These numbers or the shares are large enough that it should really concern us. And I think the European experience, again with the difference with flows and units, but again the European experience, that 2022 experience, that I think if not for the Norwegian gas and American LNG coming in at just the right moment in the perfect way, would have been absolutely catastrophic for the European economy. I think we can't forget that as we're talking about the energy transition, and that should be a stark warning to all of us in the West, that we cannot be reliant on another power for our energy security. And so I think we are taking steps to, in the United States, with the Inflation Reduction Act, with the tariffs, to rectify that. But I think what it's showing us is that's going to be a quite expensive process, right? The paradigm that we lived in for a long time was like offshore the production of the technology. We're going to drive prices down to consumers. We're all going to benefit by creating abundance and through free trade and free markets. Now we're realizing that we actually have to pay a bit of a price premium for security, and for friendshoring, for reshoring. I think that's kind of the moment that we are in now. And some of it's going to be quite clunky. So that's where we're at.
And do you think that that 25% increase in tariffs for solar panels, is it a big deal for the United States?
Yeah, I think that the 50% on solar cells, I don't think it's going to be the make or break. It's not going to make the difference between whether the US solar industry lives or dies. And as much as this is on the trade side of things, the US government is also investing a lot of money on the manufacturing subsidy sides of things. Um, and there are other trade barriers in place at the same time. I think a lot of this is just very hard to say. Like the anecdote I mentioned about the partnership between Q Cells and the Israeli startup, those, who knows what's going to happen in this, sort of in that vein over the next couple of years that either allows the Chinese firms to lurch ahead or, American-based firms rapidly cut their prices or, bring new innovations to the market. I think that's quite difficult to say. Last year, the cost declines that we saw out of the Chinese market, there's a tremendous oversupply, I think, caught a lot of people off guard. Now, there's also a question of what actually happens within the Chinese market as well, right? There will probably be a lot of consolidation among these firms, given how significant the oversupply is. So it's a very dynamic moment right now, and I think everyone is very bullish on solar generally, right? We're going to see 3 times the amount of solar deployed over the next 5 years that is deployed today, right? Like this is just moving ahead quite rapidly. But I think it is still a fairly dynamic market and innovation in the US or in China, consolidation in the Chinese market, additional protectionism from the US, from Europe, retaliatory tariffs from China could all play a role in this. So it's very up in the air. That's my non-answer to your question.
I would add my thoughts if I can. And sometimes you have the innovation and you have a final product of startup, and you want to, you want to sell the product because that's the point of business, to sell, to get some profits. But also there are guys from the gas industry, from the nuclear industry, and they are saying, oh, maybe you can reconsider the solar and maybe you can go for the nuclear, or maybe you can go for the gas, or maybe you can go for other, like hydro, for instance, hydroelectricity. So I think this is also the concept that we should think as researchers, holistically. And those players, they have natural lobbying and they influence the regulations, the laws, the legal environment, because it's not that easy to sell an energy product. I know you must have like thousands of papers of the regulations, and you have to fulfill all those requirements for the health and safety and everything. And then you can install a solar panel or technology producing energy. So I think this is also important to consider, that even though you have a cheap solar technology, there are some guys guarding the industry because they also want to make profit.
Yeah, I mean, the energy markets are, at least in the US, about as far from free markets as you can possibly imagine, right? And for good reason in some regards. But yeah, I think you should be skeptical when anyone comes and says technology X is the solution to all our problems. I'm very interested and supportive of nuclear energy, but I do not think that it is the one size fits all solution to address climate change and meet our energy needs. Same with solar. There are different characteristics to these different technologies for sure.
Great. Let's speak a little bit about the international arena. We went through the domestic US and China issues and all those, but what about the European Union and the United States? How would you differentiate the market for, let's say, renewable energy technologies? Solar panels, maybe batteries, maybe hydro. Where can you see the main differences? And maybe you can see some similarities as well.
Sure. Well, I think that Europe is further along in the conversation on climate change and has had more time to develop policies, from the pricing scheme to the CBAM that is now coming into effect. Also, just sort of the politics of climate change more generally are a bit more settled in Europe than they are in the United States. And I think that there's, Germany being a very interesting example. I happened to spend a year there after college, and I kind of got to see the Energiewende firsthand and how much there was a societal commitment to this transition from fossil to renewables, and also away from nuclear for one reason or another. So and seemed like there was quite a willingness in Germany, I think in a lot of places in Europe, to actually spend the money to push this transition forward, and use pretty heavy-handed regulations to do so as well. Here in the US, we've taken a bit of a different route. We've thrown a lot of money at innovation. So we've used a bit more of kind of the carrot approach as opposed to the stick approach when it comes to climate policy. Now, I think, again, a lot has changed in the last couple of years that may have kind of shifted, has not necessarily shifted my perspective, but may have shifted some others' perspectives on the wisdom of the carrot versus the stick, and also the ambitions embedded in programs like the Energiewende, right? We saw that the German energy system was very overextended, and it was Russian natural gas that was kind of propping it up, and when that was pulled out from underneath it, they had to reopen their coal plants, right? So I think I would describe the carrot versus the stick approach in Europe versus the US. What I'm interested in right now, I think there's this growing concern in Europe, particularly when it comes to EVs, whereas there hasn't been quite as much concern around technologies like solar. I think Europeans are getting legitimately worried that the legacy auto industry is going to crumble in Europe. And you layer on top of that the challenge of having very high energy prices, and a lot of industry collapsing anyways there. I'm not quite sure yet what this is going to look like and what sort of policy solutions the Europeans are going to develop. But I think they're starting to see the writing on the wall around China's dominant position when it comes to manufacturing, and figuring out how to try to rectify that. I think people are a bit more bellicose when it comes to China here in the US, right? We're happy to, we're in a very, sort of antagonistic, very, very antagonistic. And that's like the one bipartisan issue in the US right now is being antagonistic towards China. I think Europe is still sort of trying to figure out what sort of relationship it wants with China, and how green manufacturing and industry figures into that. So those are some of the things that come to mind for me.
It's also, when you say Europe, politically, you have European Union, then you have United Kingdom, which are two significant players in renewable energy and energy transition. And after Brexit, many things have changed. So that's also the factor. United Kingdom policy toward China and European Union policy toward China, that's two different things.
Sure.
And I think still today, I'm not 100% sure if we know what the European Union wants, when it comes to China. Because you can see Macron and Olaf from France and Germany, they visited China. But their interests were mostly for France and for Germany. Right. They haven't spoken that much about the European Union as a 27 countries. So I think this is also important issue to consider when we speak about policy toward China.
Right, and you have China opening up, Chinese firms opening up factories in Hungary and other places in Central and Eastern Europe, and so, it's a real challenge, and I think that I think it's kind of a perfect storm for the EU, with the high energy prices, the ongoing war in Ukraine, the strong mandate to address climate change, and then the threat of deindustrialization and sort of continued offshoring to China. It's a big challenge.
Definitely. And also it comes for some price for bilateral energy and trade relations. Because when you have the United States and China, and you have tariffs for particular products, then indirectly China can do the same to your products. So this is a bit of catch-22, you want to play on both sides. You want to have goods coming from China to the United States, particular quality. You want nice iPhone, but now iPhone might be produced in India or different countries, maybe Taiwan, I don't know. They trying to move the factories around. So this is, I think one thing is or can start more geopolitical movements in trade, in policy, maybe in international diplomacy. So I think this is also quite important to consider when we speak about China, United States, and the European Union, that there are more states around, and it's not only among those three entities. So that would be my comment to add something to this discussion. The second thing I want to ask you, Quill, when we speak about energy security and we speak about China, what do you think about generally the Chinese influence on technological advancement? Because this is something people are, discussing. Should we buy Chinese, let's say, switch for hydro power? Should we buy Chinese Wi-Fi adapter or receiver?
Well, actually, I'd start out with how China and the United States see energy security, just before we get to the technology side of things. The U.S. has abundant energy resources. We are the number one producer of oil in the world, number one producer of gas, the number one exporter of liquid natural gas. We start from a place of abundance. Now we can just sort of set the climate piece to the side for a second, but what we have is absolute abundance here in the United States. We can meet our energy needs from the resources here at home. China imports 70% of its oil. It has has had a rapidly growing economy over the last several decades. It's the CCP's political legitimacy is predicated on delivering high rates of economic growth. And what is the most important input for economic growth? It's energy. And so the U.S. starts from a place of abundance and relative security, whereas the Chinese start from a place of lack of abundance and insecurity when it comes to energy. They have a lot of coal resources, but importing 70% of your oil, particularly through a place like the Strait of Malacca, is something that makes them profoundly nervous. And so they've had to look outwards to find the energy resources that they need, but they've also really leaned into the secondary energy technologies like solar, like wind, and capitalized on this innovation and created these technologies both to meet their domestic needs, but also to dominate these technologies, which are increasingly importantly globally. So there's these just two very different starting points for the U.S. and China when it comes to their relationships with energy. And I think, this is not my particular area of expertise, but I think we've seen through the Belt and Road Initiative, China trying to offer sort of an alternative model in emerging markets and in some developed countries as well. Infrastructure is obviously a core part of that. And they've spent over $1 trillion on that over the last decade, and energy is a big part of it. And they've gone and bought and built coal infrastructure. Hydro infrastructure has been a very big part of it as well. Interestingly, renewables are actually not a very significant part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and a small minority of the energy projects that they financed are renewable. But that's, I think that's, they are looking out into the world, and they are trying to kind of establish themselves in the world and provide an alternative to the Western US-led order. Energy is certainly an important part of that. When it comes to these technologies, I think there absolutely is plenty of reason to be concerned about that. And the US has drawn a pretty stark line in the sand when it comes to these technologies. We've had this big debate over TikTok recently here in the US, and we've been, I think Americans are quite concerned about Chinese influence. But yeah, if you think about the implications of having a potentially adversarial government control the grid in another country, that's profound, right? That could has profound security implications, and so I think that's something that other countries should absolutely be concerned about.
When we speak about the United States, European Union, China, export, import, and energy security, I have to ask you that one important question, and that's, what's the role of international institutions in this process? How can you see bodies like World Trade Organization, perhaps some United Nations commissions and other agencies, can they mitigate those bad effects? Maybe can they help in mitigating protectionism? Maybe they can put parties together behind the multilateral desk and they can negotiate some better, trade-offs. What's your opinion about that?
I think there's certainly a role for organizations like the WTO and the UN, and, IFIs like the World Bank as well. I think the historical moment that we are at is that uh, the role of those organizations probably peaked in the early 2000s, and the pendulum is swinging the other way. Um, we are seeing a rise in nationalism, in protectionism, and deep skepticism towards those sorts of institutions. So I think they have less of a role than they did before. Um, I also do think that perhaps placing too much faith in organizations like the United Nations and the ability of multilateral organizations, but also multilateralism to address climate change issues like climate change. I do think that was a bit of an issue. The idea that we could align the priorities of 194, 195 nations or whatever it is right now to fight an issue together in lockstep. I thought was a bit. I think that was always a bit Pollyannish. And when it comes to a classic instance of great power competition, a rising power challenging a established hegemon. I'm not sure that it's those sorts of institutions are going to be able to stop that. When it comes to the WTO, this is obviously a very relevant one right now, given our the earlier points that we touched on in regards to the tariffs. The conversations that I'm having right now in DC is a lot of people are just saying WTO who like we're going to do what we want. China is going to do what they want. This going to the process at WTO may progress, but it'll take years. It's not going to have any effect on us. So I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical that they're actually going to have that much of an impact.
Do you think that we need a new institution or not? Because, if the old structures can't help and maybe we are very skeptical about their functions, I'm thinking, can we come with something new, something like global authority for energy transition, something like that?
I think there's always a place for information sharing, for gathering, but I actually think that I'm a bit of a realist when it comes to geopolitics. I think that the power resides in the nation state. I think that the international system is anarchic. Um, and I'm skeptical of universal values and universal causes. I actually think balancing and counterbalancing, sort of as we described before in terms of solar technology competition, that's actually just being honest about that, frank about what that means, is probably a better path forward than trying to overcome that competition, which I think is inherent in this system.
Right. Let's go to the last section for today's interview, and that's the energy diplomacy. And I'm interested in the US energy diplomacy and some principles that you can speak about, because my students sometimes ask me a question. If a country doesn't need to import energy, for instance, like United States that can go with own sources and resources, what's the point of having international energy diplomacy? So can you clarify this, like why energy diplomacy is important? And what's your opinion about the current way how the US is conducting energy diplomacy?
Oh, that's a great question. I think energy independence is a phrase that American politicians in particular love to throw around. It sounds so good, but it means so little. There's no such thing as energy independence, even for a country that produces massive amounts of energy like we do here in the United States. We import crude oil from other countries, refine it at our refineries, and then export it out. As we've discussed, we import massive amounts um, of solar panels from Southeast Asia. We also import electricity from Quebec through transmission lines to provide power to the Northeast, right? So even though we produce plenty of energy here, we still import and export energy through a variety of means. Energy, the energy landscape, as I discussed earlier, may change as we transition away from fossil fuels and towards clean energy, but it's still going to be incredibly globalized and integrated. So what is the role for energy diplomacy then? I think that the challenge right now for the United States is that we've really had this sort of extreme vacillation between I guess you could kind of caricature it as like drill baby drill or 100% renewables tomorrow. Um, we haven't reached an equilibrium as a country yet on how we can provide secure, affordable, and reliable energy for ourselves while also bringing down our emissions to address climate change. There's a lot of extreme policy. Um, and I think that is the big risk for us right now is that in our democratic process, as we go back and forth between the parties, we're going to see these issues that really require long-term planning get jolted around by rapid policy changes. I think that's a really serious issue. What does that look like on the international? Of course, that has like lots of domestic implications, right? Like, so ideally we can say, oh, so we have all of this natural gas. We're going to make sure that we develop it in as clean a way as possible, right? Like sort of striking the balance between the energy and climate, the energy security and climate concern. Internationally, I think the interesting question is how can we not engage in climate colonialism? How can we lift up developing countries and help them achieve energy access, many for the first time, and ideally help them reduce their environmental impact, their climate impact as well, but not do it in a, not do it in a way that is overly imposing or disrespectful or does not give them access to the economic opportunities that we have benefited from. What does that mean practically? I think there are many countries around the world that would like to develop their fossil resources. Who are we to tell Guyana that they cannot? A country that has been subject to British colonialism for many years and is far poorer than the United States. How do we have the right to tell them not to develop their oil resources? Or Mozambique, who are we to say that they can't develop their gas resources? At the same time, climate change being a fundamentally global issue and a ton of CO2 emitted in Guyana having the same effect as a ton of CO2 emitted in Georgia, USA, we need to account for that and figure out how we can enable their economic development, but also make sure that that is done in a as much as possible climate compatible way.
We know that European Union members, they import LNG from the United States as the events happened during 2022, and they try to substitute or they try to replace the Russian gas. But on the other hand, some European scholars, they are warning that we can't replace one dependency with another one. So there should be the equilibrium. And I would like to ask you, what is the US energy diplomacy towards the European Union in this very difficult question? Because I think we understand what we want. We want the stable access or stable flow of electricity or energy to the country. So what's your position or what's your opinion about being dependent? What does it mean being dependent on energy import?
Let me know when you figure that one out. That's a good question. Well, I think we have a case study of what went wrong, right? So obviously, hindsight being in 2020, the situation where a significant chunk of European energy was piped in from the Russian Federation was a critical vulnerability. I think we realized that in hindsight. I imagine that China views importing 70% of its oil as a vulnerability and dependence. I think when it comes to the U.S. and Europe, it's an interesting one because we should be natural allies and have these historical connections. We have similar values and perhaps we've sort of made mountains out of molehills over the last decade or so, particularly during the Trump administration, sort of the semantic differences. Um, I don't know if we have the luxury of doing that anymore. At least I hope that American policymakers and diplomats and European policymakers and diplomats would really realize the importance of banding together, having a strong relationship in terms of energy, but also in terms of trade and also in terms of climate, particularly when we face these shared threats like a revanchist China, in particular, and then of course things like climate change and AI development as well. It's sort of there's been I think there's been an over focus on the differences rather than the similarities when it comes to the LNG trade. I think it's hugely economically beneficial for the US. Um, it's necessary for Europe to have industry. Um, Several years ago, when Europe was still importing gas from Russia, to my knowledge, there was a DOE study that found that Russian gas was actually 40% higher emissions intensity than US LNG imports. And so I think if we're continuing to raise our standards around the emissions intensity of our LNG, then that can be can be climate compatible. And then hopefully with things like hydrogen, and differentiated supply chains for clean energy technologies, the US and Europe can be working together as well. And then final point, maybe even a climate club. That's another idea is linking the US and Europe and coordinating on on trade measures that actually account for the carbon intensity of goods that are traded around the world.
Yeah, I mean, some scholars even propose some sort of like energy pact between the United States and the European Union to be sure about those LNG exports. Because when you export, and at some way as a company, as a director, you are thinking, maybe I can earn more, and then the whole process is like domino effect. One producer is doing some tricky things, others can follow, maybe not, but it's always important to ensure that we are collaborating as the United States and the European Union in this matter, because it's crucial for both countries. I mean, people can't imagine how connected is the European Union and the United States. Unless you go deeper under, those layers of multilateralism. So that's quite interesting to know.
Yeah, I think that's been it's challenging, right? Because we've spoken very different languages on climate, spoken very different languages on energy security. I think kind of coming to a more shared understanding of how both of those priorities are balanced is really going to help facilitate a better relationship.
Yeah, and also if you just consider the latest events, like the operation in Ukraine, that's huge energy, like demand over there, for everything, and you must provide that energy in order to continue with the process. So this is like I read today an article like what is the CO2 coming out of that war in Ukraine. When you consider all those machines and guns and everything what was sent in, and then you have the Russian side. They also have thousands of equipment and everything, So this is also quite interesting to consider. Quill, the last question for today's interview, and it's going to be from your field as a researcher. And we will connect this with the solar industry and renewable energy. What would you recommend for junior researchers as areas of research that you think that they are slightly underrated, maybe under-researched? Maybe you see some research gaps that people can help with new papers, new ideas, and new thoughts. So what's your recommendation for them?
Well, in the climate space, I think certainly climate-linked trade is a growing topic. We've realized that domestic climate policies, whether it's the European Union or the US, that those things alone are not going to solve climate change. The US is 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And so figuring out how to link trade with climate is a really big task. A lot of people are moving into the space right now, but for good reason. So I think that's something to pay attention to, certainly. I think there are also just a whole bunch of different fascinating emerging technologies out there that are worth getting to know. Obviously, solar is something that is well covered right now. Geothermal is kind of an interesting space to look at as well. Long duration storage batteries. There are so many different technologies. I don't think any single one of them is going to be the solution, as we discussed before, Martin. But I think it's very helpful to familiarize yourself with a couple of them. Um, so I think those are some interesting topics. The other thing is that uh, it's my perspective that fossil fuels are going to be around a bit longer than many people hope and anticipate. The latest projections are that there's going to LNG demand is not going to peak until the late 2030s, early 2040s. There's some disagreement on that, but I think it's an unsexy topic. But figuring out how we can make fossil fuels less emissions intensive, whether it's the process of shipping LNG across the ocean or extracting oil. I think there are a bunch of different angles on that, but that is going to be a very practical way to address this issue of climate change. Something that activists often miss. We're not going to keep it in the ground. That's just not going to happen. This is going to be a gradual process. And I think if you were really looking to make a huge difference in terms of actually reducing emissions, doing research about how we can reduce emissions from flaring, make pipelines more secure and less leaky, electrifying extraction, that sort of thing are all interesting areas to dive into. And then finally, I'll just make kind of a plug for what I'm most interested in and that's, the intersection of climate change, energy security, and geopolitics, and in particular, how supply chains are going to change as the energy transition progresses, and how that, great power competition and hopefully the alliance between the US and Europe can play a role in all of that. I think it's a fascinating topic, and there's a lot of room for really good thought on that.
Quill, thank you very much for your time, insightful thoughts, and your practical overview and thoughts about energy security, geopolitics, about the solar industry in the United States and worldwide. I think the topic that we discussed today is crucial for energy transition, because we can't be close with the papers, with the research, and just follow what's on the paper, what's written. We should open our eyes more holistically and also understand the geopolitical movements, the dynamics of international relations, international trade, and all this together, that gives us some sort of answer, like where we are, where we want to be. Are we slow? Are we fast in energy transition? And do we have real outcomes of what we want to do? And I think this is very important, to have some real outcomes. So again, thank you very much, Quill, for your thoughts. Thank you for being on IR Thinker.
Thanks, Martin.
See you next time.